While public opinion totally identified and sympathized with the plight of the Palestinians as an open wound, a painful wound, a festering wound, there was as an expression of a very visible injustice. For a long time, Arab regimes exploited the cause for their own longevity and self-interest. We provided for quite some time a convenient excuse for avoiding democracy and accountability, for denying human rights and rule of law, because of the external security threat. So there was a waste of resources, people were buying weapons, people were suspending human rights and democracy, avoiding accountability, the Arab regimes, because there was a security threat, because of the Palestinian question. And this meant that militarization, coercive regimes, and so on, maintained themselves through their connection, and I'll talk about this in a little while, rather than through their own people. And that allowed for a waste of resources and continued, I would say, autocratic, partially despotic regimes. On the whole, the post-colonial legacy in the Arab world left behind many client regimes in the whole region, not just in the Arab world, and they relied for their legitimacy on external Western powers rather than on internal constituencies. That's why democracy was suspended, because the source of legitimacy for any post-colonial regime was a relationship with the West, protectorate, so to speak, for the regimes, rather than a real democratic system where you get your legitimacy from your own people, from your own constituency. And this created a relationship of mutual dependencies and mutual interests, maintaining a rule, maintaining the rule of the system or maintaining the regime regardless of violations, in exchange for guarantees, whether on oil supplies or a ready market for weapons, which all proved useless. I was telling the press this afternoon that billions and billions and billions of dollars were spent buying weapons from the US, mainly by Gulf countries that had the cash. They had the oil, they had the cash, and the US knew how to siphon off the money back into the US by selling all these so-called sophisticated weapons. And yet when Iraq invaded Kuwait, they had to rent an army in order to protect them. And they spent trillions of dollars paying for the American army. So in a sense, what's the use of all those billions of dollars since they're not used for self-protection by anybody? It's just one way in which the West maintained that they can get the money back into the West and maintain regimes that are their clients, that can depend on them, guarantee the sources of oil, and at the same time carry out, of course, functional tasks. The most functional state in the region for the US is Israel, and we can talk about this later. Thus, a simplistic polarization emerged in the Arab world, a corrupt, largely corrupt, inept, not all of them, I don't want to generalize, but a nationalist regime versus political Islam. No third options, no third democratic parties were allowed to emerge. They were often excluded and targeted by both. It's very easy if you are a nationalist regime and if you have the military and the weapons and the money and control the resources to undermine and to destroy any opposition, except for the Islamic opposition, because they act in the name of God and they have religious institutions that you cannot target. So there was this polarization in the Arab world, and the most visible outcome of this was what happened in Algiers when there was an election in which the Islamists won the elections and the nationalist forces refused to recognize this, which launched a whole period of civil war and a total waste of lives and resources. It was the most painful history in Algiers post, of course, the colonial period. And the same thing, we'll talk about what happened in Palestine. In the early 60s, I talked about the PLO was formed, and the Arab world wanted, in many ways, to maintain the Palestinian cause as one that can be controlled and managed up until, of course, the mid-60s, in which the PLO became the voice of nationalism and identity and revolution. In the Cold War era, of course, the US, I don't want to say the West because there are many different positions in the West. Europe is not entirely identical with the US position, supported the emergence of ideological and political Islam in order to combat Arab nationalism and communism. Remember, the Cold War era was the era in which the end justified the means, in which they supported the Taliban and so on in Afghanistan in order to fight communism, in which the Muslim Brotherhood was supported in order to fight, of course, socialism, communism, and Arab nationalism, because it was imperative for Israel that there can be no Arab unity. And this became an integral part of American foreign policy. Maintain a fragmented Arab world, do not allow for unity, and do not allow in any way for the empowerment of the Arab world. And so we are still paying the price of that policy, and it is still ongoing in many ways until they realized that somehow the allies they supported and in many cases created in order to combat nationalism and progressive ideologies are in themselves the first to turn against Western interests and against the US and Israel. I remember when Israel used to look upon Hamas very kindly when it emerged in the early 1988. They thought Hamas was the instrument that is going to destroy the PLO. And I remember they used to arrest us, beat us up, but let Hamas people go. And even in jail, they gave them special treatment if they ever arrested them. And now they realize that Hamas turned against them immediately. So maybe they made a mistake in trying to undermine the PLO. I don't want to go into too many details here because I think it'll take too much time. But let's say in 1967, Israel's occupation of Arab land, which included, of course, the West Bank and Jerusalem from Jordan, Gaza and Sinai from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and, of course, South Lebanon, signaled the overall defeat of the Arab regimes and reintroduced the security pretext under the title Removing the Effects of Aggression, in the sense that in 1967 there was an Israeli aggression, and now all the Arab regimes had to try to remove the effects of the aggression. It enhanced the rift also between the Arabs and the PLO, leading to outright confrontation in Jordan in 1970, Syria and Lebanon also in the 70s, and to appeasement or sponsorship. Many of the Gulf countries tried to avoid any confrontation with the PLO because they didn't want destabilization in their own countries. In 1973, the October 6 War, otherwise known as Yom Kippur War, with Egypt and Syria, regained some of the lost Arab pride and prepared the grounds for the Camp David Accords, which were signed in 1979. And of course, the signing of the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel also led to another major rift in the Arab world because Egypt was extracted, let's say, from the confrontation states and signed a separate peace with Israel. And the effects lasted for a long time. However, just as the 1973 war prepared for peace between Israel and Egypt, the Camp David Accords that they signed later on introduced and gradually normalized the idea of peace with Israel through negotiations, as opposed to the 3 no's of Khartoum. There was the very famous 3 no's: no negotiations, no recognition, no coexistence with Israel, that were adopted by the Arab Summit in 1967 in Khartoum following the 1967 war. In their place, now, there was more of an acceptance that there would be a negotiated settlement with Israel. It wasn't until the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which you had a lot to do with, I guess, here, and the fall of the Soviet Union, and the first war, and the American war, the first American war on Iraq in 1991, that a serious process was launched by the US, the Madrid process. This was partly in response to the demand by the Arabs who had joined the Allies in the war against Iraq and who needed stability and longevity and who felt that their own public was turning against them for taking part in a war against another Arab country. So they wanted in return a peace process that would solve the Palestinian question. By now, it had become clear that the threat to the region and the regimes did not lie in the potential of the Palestinian state, as they thought before, but rather in its absence. You see, for a long time, and it was no secret, it's the worst kept secret in history, the Arab leaders would go and talk in secret to the Americans or others and tell them, we don't need a Palestinian state. Let's not work on a Palestinian state. Maybe we can control the situation. Because they were worried that the Palestinian state would have a spillover effect. They were afraid that it might be a progressive state, a radical state, a communist state, or it might be a democratic state, and it might be contagious. As lots of Arab leaders used to tell us, you're troublemakers, we don't know how to cope with you. And we certainly are. People under occupation learn how to be good troublemakers in a positive sense. But anyway, we refuse coercion and oppression. And if you are people who refuse coercion and oppression, you're not going to be docile if you have a repressive system. So in many ways, they saw in a Palestinian state as a destabilizing element, and they fought it for a long time. But it wasn't until the early 90s or the late 80s that they decided that the destabilizing factor was the absence of the Palestinian state, not the state itself. And therefore, they demanded payback, that if you're going to enlist us in the war against Iraq, then you need to resolve the Palestinian question because of its impact on public opinion. It's one of the, as I said, the most emotive, the most effective, the most emotional cause to the Arab public as a whole. So now they were trying to get the Palestinian state going, but at that time nobody was talking about a state. It was taboo. The Americans wouldn't even discuss it. The Israelis wouldn't discuss it. You never mentioned the Palestinian state. When in '93 somebody like Hillary Clinton talked about the Palestinian state, all hell broke loose. But the perpetuation of the Palestinian-Israeli, hence the Arab-Israeli conflict, was seen by all these leaders as sapping resources and undermining the political systems and the political elites also in the Arab world. More importantly, the defeat or the failure of the regimes, all of them, whether they're nationalists, whether they're progressive, or whether they're tribal, or whether they're dynastic. We have a very strange phenomenon in the Arab world. It's not just the families that run certain countries that have dynasties, but now even the so-called elected democracies, the elected republics, also have dynasties, where they try to pass the rule by succession. This is very interesting, Started in Syria, it was very clear. In Libya, it's being arranged. In Egypt, I think. In several other places, there are also. We used to tell Arafat it's a good thing that Zahwa was only, I think it was 4 years old when. Otherwise, we will end up having to change the law and say that we need a woman whose minimum age or maximum age was 4.5 or something like that.